Okay. Hi, everyone. I think we're going to get going tonight. It's really exciting to see so many people here again tonight. I see some new names, which is really exciting, but I also see lots of the same names, people who've been here pretty much through the entire webinar series. So thank you very much. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Catherine Dale. I am the coordinator of the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas. And here also tonight is Jenna McDermott, the assistant coordinator. And Jenna is going to be keeping an eye on the chat and just generally giving me a hand should any technology not cooperate. Jenna and I both work for an organization called Birds Canada, which you may or may not be familiar with. But essentially, we are a nonprofit, nationwide nonprofit dedicated to the understanding, appreciation, and conservation of wild birds and their habitats. And so we work to carry out our mission through conducting strong science and establishing a lot of partnerships with governments, with other non-governmental organizations, and with industry. And we run a number of programs in provinces across the country, which are largely citizen science programs. So we're going to talk a fair amount about citizen science tonight, but in case you're not familiar with the term, essentially that involves people just like you going out and collecting data for scientific studies and submitting that data to a central database. So each year, Birds Canada programs engage more than 70,000 volunteers nationwide, which is a mind-blowing number to me, but we really couldn't do what we do without you guys. Here in Newfoundland, we're relatively recent arrivals. So we only established our office in Newfoundland in 2019. And we have two programs here in Newfoundland. The first is the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas, and I'm not going to go into great detail about that on this slide because the rest of the presentation is all about the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas. But our second program, which I do just want to touch on before we go into the Atlas, is the Nocturnal Owl Survey. And I want to bring that up because for those of you who haven't heard me talk about it before, that's something that's happening right now. So that's another citizen science survey. It takes place each year between April 1st and May 15th. And what it involves is citizen scientists going out along a predetermined route of 10 stops and listening for owls at each of those stops and reporting back to us about what they've heard. Protocol is a little more complicated than that, but I can certainly answer questions about it later if you like. So these are the current owl routes we have in Newfoundland. We do also have 4 routes in Labrador, which you can just see the tip of one of them there. But obviously we are looking to expand our routes because we do have some substantial gaps in coverage. Particularly, we're looking for people to either take on existing routes or establish new routes in Carmanville, Badger Lake, anywhere on the Bayverde Peninsula, anywhere on the Northern Peninsula, and anywhere in Central. So if anyone's interested in conducting an owl survey, just send me an email and I will be happy to work with you to set up a route. And finally, just before we go into the details of the Atlas, I want to thank all of our partners and all of our funders. Without their support, we really could not do workshops like this. And we certainly wouldn't be able to run the Atlas because it's a pretty massive project. So just a quick thank you to them. Okay, so into the atlasing part. And I always start talks about the Newfoundland Atlas with a story about this species, but I figured we might as well start tonight with a quiz. So I know at least some of the people here have been here for other presentations. Can anyone tell me in the chat what this species is? I'm looking at the chat here, so any thoughts? Broad guesses. Okay, so we've got a few people saying Swainson's thrush and gray-cheeked thrush. So, okay, you got it down to thrush. And somebody said it was a bird, and that is completely true. Definitely a bird, so excellent start. Definitely a thrush, also excellent. The main way to tell the difference between the Swainson's thrush and the gray-cheeked thrush is you're looking for buff in the face. And specifically, you're looking for sort of those buffy eyeglasses almost for a Swainson's thrush. So this is actually a gray-cheeked thrush. So anybody who was at the presentation last week might remember that gray-cheeked thrush, interestingly, are actually genetically distinct here in Newfoundland. So we have our own subspecies of gray-cheeked thrush. The species itself is distributed all across northern Canada, but genetically, the birds on the island are distinct. So in 2005, the Canadian Wildlife Service asked biologist Derek Whitaker to formally evaluate the population of our specific subspecies, so the Newfoundland gray-cheeked thrush. They were hearing reports from birders that there might be fewer of them showing up, but nobody had really formally evaluated them. And so they really wanted to know, were gray-cheeked thrush doing okay, or did we need to be worried about this? And so Derek took this on, but he didn't quite realize how difficult it would be. So he had data from breeding bird surveys, which are a little bit different from the atlas, that they involve birders going out just one day in the summer and doing a route of 50 stops and listening for birds. And they're done all across North America as well. So he had this breeding bird survey data from the 1970s and early 1980s. And so what this data indicated is that gray-cheeked thrush were actually relatively abundant during those surveys. But in about 1984, we pretty much stopped doing breeding bird surveys here in Newfoundland. And because of that, it was really impossible to know whether the decline that the birders were reporting was something that was actually happening. Like, there was no way to evaluate it quantitatively. And so when Derek wrote this status assessment in 2005, he couldn't really come to a conclusion. He said, it looks like they're declining, but it's hard to support that scientifically. However, in the early 2000s, Canadian Wildlife Service worked to restart these breeding bird surveys here in Newfoundland. And so in 2010, Derek said, okay, let me take another crack at this evaluation, the status report for the gray-cheeked thrush, because now he had data from these later breeding bird surveys. And what he found using these surveys is that gray-cheeked thrush populations had declined in coastal parts of Newfoundland by almost 95% over a 40-year span. So that's a massive decline. And that led to the species being listed as threatened under the Provincial Endangered Species Act. And it's currently being evaluated to determine its federal status by the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. So I always like to start Atlas Talks with this story, even though it's not a great story for the gray-cheeked thrush, but it's a really good illustration of why it's important for us to have solid baseline data about the distribution, the abundance, and the health of bird populations, because we really can't know what we're losing, or sometimes even what we're gaining, if we don't know what's out there. But unfortunately for us, a lot of that baseline data is lacking for many species that breed on the island of Newfoundland. And as you may have guessed, I'm guessing you know where this is going, that is where the Breeding Bird Atlas comes in. So those of you who have been coming all along, you'll have heard me talk about breeding bird atlases before, but this is the official definition of a breeding bird atlas. So it's a comprehensive, systematic assessment of the distribution and abundance of breeding bird species in a jurisdiction over a 5-year period. So in Canada, the jurisdiction is usually a province. In the case of Newfoundland, it is just the island of Newfoundland, not Labrador as well. Breeding bird atlases have traditionally been published as books. So those are the covers of 3 recent breeding bird atlases. They're beautiful books. They are, however, quite expensive and expensive to produce. And so as of the last few breeding bird atlases, we've actually moved more to an online format. So this is the website of the Breeding Birds of Manitoba Atlas, which was completed, I believe, in 2010. 2014. And this is great because, well, actually there are several reasons, but the big thing is it's available to everyone. So you don't have to buy an expensive book to get at the Manitoba Breeding Bird Atlas. And the main part of the online book is these species accounts. So basically for each species where there was evidence of breeding in the province of Manitoba, they have a little written up species account. So there's a photo usually taken by an atlaser. There's a little bit of a write-up about the species, and then these 3 maps at the bottom. And I'm really just going to focus on 2 of them for now. And this is the map of breeding evidence and the abundance map. So the map of breeding evidence, each of these colored squares represents a place where evidence for breeding of bobolink was found. And the yellow represents possible breeding. So the bird was there, but we're not sure if it's breeding. The orange represents probable breeding, and the red represents confirmed breeding. And then the relative abundance just tells you where you are where the most bobolinks are. So where is the core of the population? And then the other really cool thing about having an online breeding bird atlas is that you can also sort the data by location. So you can sort it by species and look for all the places a given species is found. But let's say, for example, you're going on a trip to Churchill, Manitoba, because you want to see polar bears. But while you're there, you figure you might as well get some birding in. And you can do this by basically looking up the square that contains Churchill, Manitoba. So you can say, okay, you want all of the years, but you want the summary statistics by square within this region or and this particular square. And then it will give you a list of all of the species that were found in that square. So you know what you might encounter when you go to Churchill. And that's a really neat feature of having an online book. Atlases have been done in virtually all Canadian provinces to this point. And one of the other neat things is that we can combine data from different bird atlases. So we do them by province, but we can bring all of those data together to get a picture of the nationwide distribution of bird species. So this is a rusty blackbird, and you can see here that we have an idea of the abundance of rusty blackbird all across Canada. However, you will notice that there are absolutely no rusty blackbirds starting halfway through Quebec and in Newfoundland and Labrador. And those of you who were here for the species at risk talk last week will know that that is not the case. We do indeed have rusty blackbird here. But what we don't have yet is a breeding bird atlas. So Newfoundland and Labrador is the last province to do a modern breeding bird atlas. This map is a little bit old since it was made. Saskatchewan has completed its first breeding bird atlas, and Ontario has actually just begun its third breeding bird atlas. And so because we don't have information for Newfoundland, it's a gap in our understanding of the status and the distribution of birds in Canada. And it's also kind of unfortunate not to have the information, the baseline information about birds here, because Newfoundland is actually important for birds. So some of the largest and most important seabird colonies in the world, for example, the largest colony in the world of Leach's storm petrels is on Baccalieu Island. The largest colony of Atlantic puffins in North America is in the Witless Bay Ecological Reserve. So we're really important for a lot of seabird species, but we also have unique subspecies of birds. So like the gray-cheeked thrush that I was talking about and the red crossbill, for example. So it's really important that we know what's going on with these bird populations. And in addition, Newfoundland is likely to experience significant impacts of climate change, which could result in range shifts for many species like the Canada jay, so the whiskey jack that we've talked about, and maybe the boreal owl, which we might even be seeing now. And so it's really important that we establish a baseline for the distribution of these species now. And so this is where the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas comes in. And I know that I've already mentioned our partners, but I want to take a second again to just highlight the fact that it definitely takes a village to do a breeding bird atlas. And so to do this, Birds Canada has partnered with Environment and Climate Change Canada, the Government of Newfoundland and Labrador, Parks Canada, Memorial, the Stewardship Association of Municipalities, and the Eastern Habitat Joint Venture. So it's really, we could not be doing this without the help of all of these organizations. And again, we really couldn't be doing it without you guys, without citizen scientists. So the success of the Atlas relies extremely heavily on volunteer birders, people just like you who observe birds and submit those observations to our online database. It's absolutely essential. And so part of this talk is going to focus on how exactly you do that. So the goal of the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas is to map the distribution and the abundance of all of the species of birds breeding on the island of Newfoundland. As I said, we're not taking on Labrador at this time. I hope sometime in the future there will be a Labrador Breeding Bird Atlas, but Newfoundland is enough of a challenge for now. This atlas, we started our first data collection season in 2020. We are now coming up to our third data collection season. So we will continue until the end of 2024. And the absolute peak season for atlasing is the 7th of June to the 7th of July. But that doesn't mean that that's the only time that we accept data. So many species breed before or after that. Some of our owl species are out there breeding already. Birds like cedar waxwings and American goldfinch, they breed quite late in the summer. And so really we will take observations of species year round. But the core season is that 7th of June to the 7th of July, because that's when you get the most species breeding here in Newfoundland. So how do you atlas an island the size of Newfoundland? And believe me, this is a question I ask myself every day. But luckily for me and for all of us at Birds Canada, there is a standardized approach to this. So the first thing you want to do is divide your jurisdiction up into 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer atlas squares. These are the basic units of atlasing. And here in Newfoundland, we have 1,485 squares, which is a number that I do see in my sleep, yes. We have grouped those squares together into 8 different administrative regions. Because each of those regions is run by a regional coordinator who's familiar with birders in the area and also familiar with the area itself. And so that's really helpful for us as an Atlas office because we have somebody on the ground in each of these different regions. So for Newfoundland that comes out to 8 regions, although you may notice that region number 8 here is actually a different country. That's Saint Pierre and Miquelon. The fact that we have a French region in this atlas makes us the only international atlas as far as I know. And then we realize that it's extremely unlikely that we're going to get to 1,485 squares in the 5 years of the atlas. And so what we've done is assign priority to squares. There's nothing particularly special about the squares that we have deemed priority. So the black ones that you see here are top priority squares, and that's 25% of our squares. And then the white dots or the unfilled dots are priority 2 squares, which is another 15%. There's nothing particularly special about those squares. They were actually assigned pretty much at random. Well, actually, they were assigned systematically, as you can tell from looking at the map. The reason that we have priority squares is that we want to ensure even coverage across the island. So we don't want a situation where everybody puts all of their effort into a couple of really interesting places, for example, Gros Morne and Terra Nova and the Avalon Peninsula. We really want to encourage people to go out and cover some of these lesser traveled squares, and that's what the priority is about. It does not mean that we won't take data from non-priority squares. We absolutely will. When you're collecting data, there are 3 different types you can collect. So incidental observations, general atlasing data, and point counts. And I'm going to talk briefly about each of them. So incidental observations are pretty much any bird, anywhere. When you are not out birding, but you happen to notice something. So basically, let's say you're out for a drive and you happen to see a great horned owl sitting on a nest. That is extremely important information for us, and we will absolutely take that information. This happens primarily from late May to mid-August, but again, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't come across this information outside of that time period. Owls breed very early, so you may in fact see an owl breeding right now, and we would take that information. The thing about incidental observations, they're very helpful, but they don't come with any measure of effort. So they don't tell me how long you spent trying to see that owl because it was actually just an incidental information. And so it tells us about the presence, tells us that something is there, but it doesn't tell us anything about absence. We can only really know about absence when we have some idea how long people have spent looking for something and still not seen it. So incidental observations are very helpful. To submit incidental observations, you just have to be signed up for the atlas, and you can submit them from anywhere, anytime. The next step up is general atlasing data. And essentially what this is a square level search. So the picture you see there is a map of one of those 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer squares. I think that one is actually close to Port Basque. And so what we're aiming for in each of those squares is 12 to 20 hours of atlasing. We want people to be searching those squares for between 12 and 20 hours. That's a really wide range, you might notice. And that is because it depends a lot on the time that you put in. Like, are you looking in May or are you looking in June? Are you surveying during peak season? It can also sometimes depend on the experience of the birder. So I myself am very much a learning birder. And because of that, I would prefer to spend longer in a square before calling it complete, because I want to be sure that I've gotten everything that I can. Again, this happens primarily from late May to mid-August. And this provides us information about the presence of species, but it also provides us information about the absence of species. So if you spent 20 hours looking in a square, but you have not seen an olive-sided flycatcher, then we can have a little bit more confidence that that species is not there. When you are searching the square, you'll see that the map there has different types of habitat, and you can hopefully see in the legend here what those are. So this particular square, I can't see terribly well, but you've got some broadleaf forest, some coniferous forest, lots of shrubland, lots of water, obviously. And so when you are deciding how to allocate your effort, you want to spend approximately proportional amount of time in each habitat. So here you would want to spend approximately 25% of your time in the shrubland habitat to make sure that you're capturing it. And these maps are available for every single square in Newfoundland on our Nature Counts database. Oh, there we go, a much better view of it. And yes, okay, so not 25% of your time in shrubland, you'd spend about 10% of your time in shrubland and about 40% of your time in mixed-wood forest. So I just want to touch briefly on square assignments. Some bigger atlases, for example, Ontario, square assignments are really important. Basically, when you sign up for a square, you contact the regional coordinator for that region and you say, okay, this is my square. That means that you are committing to complete the 12 to 20 hours of general atlasing that we need to call that square done. It does not mean that you can only submit data for that square, and it also doesn't mean that other people can't submit data for that square. But what it does is it sort of helps us organize the effort. If we know that somebody is signed up for that square and has committed to completing the 12 to 20 hours of general atlasing, then we probably won't have our field teams spend a lot of time there. You do not have to sign up for a square to participate in the atlas. It is very much not required. But if you do, it sort of helps us organize. If you do happen to be interested in signing up for a particular square, the way to do it is to get in touch with the regional coordinator for that region, or with Jenna and myself, and we'll direct you to the right person. Okay, and then our last kind of data is point counts. And some of you may be familiar with point counts. They are basically exactly what they sound like. So during a point count, you stand at a predetermined point and you record all of the birds you see or hear during a specific time period, which in the case of the atlas is 5 minutes. So point counts are really, really important because they allow us to generate those abundance maps that I showed you. So all of the general atlasing data goes into producing those breeding distribution maps, but the point counts go into generating the abundance maps. However, point counts do require slightly more specialized protocol and a more specialized skill set than other atlas data collection types. And this is because most species are more often heard than seen. So doing a point count involves an awful lot of identifying birds by ear. They do have a much shorter window than the other data collection periods. So these are the counts that we only do between the 7th of June and the 7th of July. And this is because this is when most species are vocal. So if we're depending on sound to identify them, we need them to be singing. They're done each day between half an hour before sunrise and 4.5 hours after sunrise. So they also involve being a bit of an early riser, which myself, I find quite a struggle. Jenna will attest to this. Where do you do the point counts? Well, if we look again at that square map that I showed you, this is a different square. This is up at Cape Friels. But you can see that on the map, you've got all of these little points. So we have two different types of point counts in the atlas. We have on-road point counts and we have off-road point counts. The square information sheet tells you, in this case, that this square, we are expected to do 10 predefined or on-road point counts and 5 off-road point counts. So we need to get 10 of these points done. And the way you do it, you'll notice there's way more than 10, and this is just in case some of those points are inaccessible or unsafe. So what you do is you start at number 1 and you take the first 10, unless you happen to find, for example, this road is a little bit sketchy. You're certainly not driving this. Maybe you're not able to walk it, in which case you wouldn't do numbers 7 and 5. Instead, you would add numbers 11 and 12. So that's how you choose which on-road points to stop at. When you're doing the off-road points, you can put them anywhere. You do need to place them beforehand. So we don't want people just stopping when they hear something interesting. We want you to choose ahead of time so that it really is a random representation of the square. But here it will tell you what kind of habitat you're going for. So here we know we need 5 off-road point counts. 4 of them should be in wetlands and 1 of them should be in barren. And you can look at the habitat types on this map to figure out where you want to place your point counts. Each square, we're aiming for a total of 15 point counts. Now, many people may be saying that they are not comfortable doing point counts, and full disclosure here, I'm still working on that myself, but we do have a solution. So this is using bioacoustics, and that is collecting bird survey data through audio recordings. So instead of you doing a point count yourself, you can take a handheld Zoom recorder, which is what I have a picture of there, and you can take it out to the points on the map, set up the Zoom recorder on a tripod with a little windscreen on it, and press record and record the 5-minute point count that way and submit the audio recordings for us. And we do have a number of these Zoom recorders available to borrow. So if you are keen to do point counts, we are more than happy to let you borrow a recorder and take it out there. The same rules apply, so you do need to do it between half an hour before sunrise to 4.5 hours after sunrise. It does need to be done between the 7th of June and the 7th of July, and we don't do them in bad weather. But it's a great way to check out point counts. Either you can contribute if you don't want to do point counts at all, or you can test yourself. So go out, do your own point count, and then listen to the recording after and see how you did. And I will say that they are a lot of fun to take around during the breeding season. This is my Zoom recorder from last summer. His name was Atticus. He had a hot dog with us that night by the campfire. So they're kind of fun to have with you. And it's neat to listen to the recordings after. If you're interested in taking out a Zoom recorder, again, you would contact the regional coordinator for that region or Jenna or myself. And there are detailed instructions about the settings to use and the data that you need to collect when you're doing a point count with a Zoom recorder online. So just make sure to read that, because it would be unfortunate to not be able to use the recordings, and that has happened to us a couple times. If you're going to collect them, definitely want to make sure you're collecting the right information. Okay, so we'll move on a little bit. We've talked a lot about how we collect data. Let's talk about what data we collect with the Atlas. And part of the reason that I think the Atlas is so neat, my background is in animal behavior. And when I started with the Atlas, I was really excited to realize that behavioral ecology, or animal behavior, is a really important part of what we do with the Atlas. So we're not just interested in what bird species you see, but we're also interested in what they're doing. So with each bird observation, you provide a breeding evidence code, and that tells us how sure we can be that that species is breeding in that location. And an observation is really only useful to the Atlas when we can associate it with some kind of breeding evidence. So there's a standardized list of breeding evidence codes, and I'm actually going to go through them with you. Some of them are really obvious and others are a little bit trickier to use. And the quiz today is focused partly on the breeding evidence codes. So hopefully people are paying attention here. So the first one is actually not breeding evidence at all. It's the code X. It just means I observed this. So it means the species was observed, but it's not in suitable nesting habitat. So for example, if you happen to observe a ring-billed gull sitting in the middle of a parking lot, chances are it's not breeding in the middle of the parking lot. So you would give it an X. You would say, I observed this species here at this time on this day, but you have no evidence that it was breeding there. The next level up, we start moving into possible breeding evidence codes. And these are the ones that I find myself using a lot. So possible code, the first one is H. And this is species is observed in suitable nesting habitat during their breeding season. So for example, here we have a black-throated green warbler. It's in deciduous forest. It's hanging out in a tree. It's the right nesting habitat, but I have no other evidence that it is breeding. So I would give this an H, which is that yellow color. It's possible breeding. The next step up is a singing male or adult producing other sounds associated with breeding. So some of you may remember that winnowing sound that Wilson snipe make, which sound an awful lot like boreal owls. So snipe winnowing is an S. It's another sound associated with breeding. And it's happening in suitable nesting habitat during the species breeding season. But again, we don't have any more evidence than the fact that it's singing. So here we have a bay-breasted warbler seen in June in suitable habitat in Western Newfoundland, singing its little heart out. And so that would get an S as a code. Probable breeding. So we've now moved into the next level up. There are a number of codes associated with probable breeding. A common one is multiple. So when you have 7 or more individuals heard during one visit to a single square. So for here, for example, we have 4 Savannah sparrows also singing their little hearts out. They would get an N. So we've moved from, still all we're observing is singing, but if you have 7 Savannah sparrows singing during one visit, then really it should have been 7, sorry, not 4. Then you have moved into pretty probable breeding. So you've moved a level up. Pair. So pair observed in suitable nesting habitat during the species breeding season. So here we have our pair of Barrow's goldeneye, and that gets a P. That's also probable breeding. This one is a little bit tricky. So it's a little bit like multiple. So again, it's probable breeding, but this is a territory, and it's based on the presence of an adult bird, usually singing or performing some other vocal display, but not necessarily. But what you call it a territory when you see it over multiple visits that are at least 1 week apart during the breeding season. So if you visit your square one day in early June and you happen to see a Savannah sparrow singing, and then you come back 2 weeks later and you see and hear a Savannah sparrow singing again, you would use T. Another probable breeding code is D, courtship displays involving a male and female. So things like courtship feeding, copulation, or antagonistic behavior. So territorial fighting between often males, that would get a D display. So our example here is a male spruce grouse displaying to a female. So that is probable breeding. V is a bird visiting a probable nest site in suitable habitat during the breeding season. So here, for example, we have our black-capped chickadee, and we know that these guys are cavity nesters. They like to nest in tree cavities. And if you see this guy poking his head out of a cavity, but then you don't see him again after April, you would give him a V for probable breeding. If you see him going back and forth to that cavity throughout the entire summer, then the code changes. Another probable breeding code is A, agitated behavior or alarm calls of an adult in suitable nesting habitat during the species breeding season. And so the example I always like to use for this one is the greater yellowlegs, because they like to perch at the top of trees and alarm call at you repeatedly. And so they get an A for agitated behavior. Another code, this is one that you probably will not find yourselves using very often. This is a B, so it's a brood patch or cloacal protuberance on an adult in suitable nesting habitat during the breeding season. What do I mean by a brood patch? Well, when usually the female, whichever bird incubates, when they sit on the eggs and the nestlings, they get this patch of skin, which is bare of feathers, highly vascularized, kind of warm and squishy, and it is good evidence of breeding. However, as you may notice, you really need to have a bird in your hand before you'll be able to tell a brood patch. A cloacal protuberance, same thing. So the cloaca is the exit for the bird's excretory systems as well as its reproductive system. And so males, when they are producing a lot of sperm during the breeding season, will store it in the cloaca, and it will bulge out. But again, that's not something you're going to see from a distance. You actually need to have the bird in your hand. So it's extremely unlikely that most people will be using that particular breeding evidence code. And then I believe this is the last breeding evidence code that comes under the probable category, and that is N, and it's nest building by wrens or nest hole excavation by woodpeckers. And you may wonder at the specificity of that, but the reason that this code only applies to wrens and woodpeckers is that both of them may build dummy nests or roosting nests. So they build extra nests. And so essentially, just because they're building a nest, it's not enough to confirm breeding, because they don't always lay eggs in the holes and cavities that they build. And so here we have an example of a downy woodpecker excavating a nest cavity. That would get an N for probable breeding. Okay, and now we move into our confirmed breeding codes. So we've gone up a level, and you'll notice that all of the confirmed breeding codes are 2 letters. So this is the gold standard. We love it when we can confirm breeding for things. This is what we're going for. We want the highest level of breeding evidence possible. So nest building, including carrying of nesting material by everything except woodpeckers and wrens, is confirmed breeding. So here we have a purple finch carrying nesting material, and that would be confirmed breeding. Distraction displays. So some of you may remember that I talked about the broken wing displays that shorebirds will often do. So things that are designed to draw attention away from nest or young, that is also confirmed breeding. So here we have a killdeer doing a distraction display. Nest used, so NU. So this is either finding an empty nest or finding identifiable eggshells from earlier in the same nesting season. This is a tough code to use, and it's tough for several reasons. One, a lot of nests are not particularly species specific, so it can be very difficult to identify a species from a nest alone. So for example, and that's also true of eggshells. If you find this nest, do you know what it belongs to? Do you know for sure? And this was actually a photo taken in Alberta, and I knew it was a chipping sparrow nest because the fledglings were actually sitting beside it. But in that case, without that kind of evidence, it can be really, really hard to use that NU code. The other thing is you need to be sure that it's from the same breeding season, and that is also very difficult to ascertain. I have used the NU code once in the field when I found robin eggshells, which are pretty distinctive, but otherwise it's a difficult code for sure. So that's chipping sparrow used nest. Recently fledged young, so either altricial young, which are the ones that stay in the nest, so the naked nestlings that stay in the nest and are fed by their parents for a period of time. Eventually they pop out of the nest, but they're not really capable of sustained flight. Or downy young, so for precocial birds like shorebirds and many waterfowl, the young pop right out of the nest shortly after they're hatched. But again, when they're young and incapable of sustained flight, you know that they were hatched pretty close to where you're seeing them. And so that is also confirmed breeding for that square. So here, for example, we have a horned lark, recent fledgling. So he's all fuzzy. You can tell that he's not going long distances. So he definitely hatched in the square that we're seeing him in. Adult entering, occupying, or leaving a nest site. And I really want to emphasize this occupying. So if you see a bird actually sitting in a nest, AE is the code to use, even though it means adult entering. So occupied nests get an AE code, and obviously that is confirmed breeding. So this American robin that is entering and then sitting on the nest would be confirmed breeding for sure. FS, adult carrying a fecal sac. So you may be aware that many young passerines actually, they poop in little gelatinous sacs, which enables the parents to pick up the sac and take it away from the nest. It's a nest sanitation method. And so if you happen to see an adult bird carrying a fecal sac, some big bulky white sac, then that is also confirmed breeding. So here we have a female red-winged blackbird carrying a fecal sac. The probably single most popular code that you're going to use for confirmed breeding is adult carrying food for young. So for passerine birds like this Wilson's warbler, when they've got their bills full of food, that is definitely confirmed breeding. And then if you're lucky, you can find a nest containing eggs. And obviously that is confirmed breeding. So this is an American pipit nest with eggs. And same thing applies for a nest with young that can either be seen or heard. So this is a flicker nest. I think that was it was one of the provincial parks in Newfoundland, and you can see the nestlings sticking their heads out of the nest, but you could also hear them quite clearly, and that would be NY, confirmed breeding. I think it's really important to note when we're talking about breeding evidence, it's great to find a nest, and it's really satisfying sometimes to find a nest, but it's not necessary to confirm breeding. So we're really excited when we can confirm breeding for a species, but we don't need people to go out and find nests. And in fact, it's better, birds find it quite stressful if you spend a lot of time looking for and hanging around their nest. And you can spend more time looking for other species. So we don't need people to find nests. Okay, so we are now going to go into the quiz. There's a little bit after, but I figured we could break things up with the quiz because I just sent a lot of information your way. So this is a two-part quiz. We have 5 questions, each have 2 parts. So the first question is simply, what species do we have here? So feel free to answer Answer the poll here. What species do we have? People are pretty sure of this one. Okay. Any final guesses? We're at 75% participation. Anyone else want to jump in there? Okay. I'm going to end the poll. And yes, 87% of people were right. This is an American robin. Northern water thrush are smaller. They don't have the red breast. Virio wouldn't have the red breast. Pine grosbeak, you probably wouldn't find hopping around on the ground, among other things. So this is a grumpy, grumpy little American robin that Jenna and I actually watched last summer, trying to figure out what food was, essentially. So now I'm going to get you to close that poll if you haven't already. So this is the second part. You're out in the field and you see a young American robin, barely able to fly, hopping about on a lawn or in the forest. What breeding evidence would you give this? So what would the code be for this guy? And this is not a trick question, I promise. I know I was tricky last week, but and some of these may be trick questions. All right, any last minute guesses? We're just over 80% participation, so I'm going to close the poll. I want to make sure that I don't keep you too late tonight. Okay. All right, so again, 89% of you are correct. This is recently fledged or downy young. So this is a confirmed evidence of breeding because this particular bird, although it may be hopping around out of the nest, it hasn't gone very far for sure. And so you can be pretty sure that this bird, that robins are breeding in the square that you're in. Okay, so next species identification question. What do we have here? People are a little bit less sure of this one, it looks like. Okay, get in your last minute guesses. I'm going to close the poll. Oh, a few people still guessing. Okay. All right, so I'm going to end the poll there, share the results. 60% of people did get it correct. So it is a barn swallow. You can tell it's a swallow because of the streamlined body, the short little legs, that kind of wide but flat bill. Bank swallows, you would expect to be brownish and to have a band across the chest, not this sort of cinnamony throat and top of chest, and then this dark blue head. And a flycatcher, you would expect to be much more upright. So a yellow-bellied flycatcher would be sitting quite upright. Also less likely to be sitting on a power line. And blue-headed vireo, it was a tricky one because it does have a blue head, I admit. Blue-headed vireo, you would expect those spectacles on the face, among other things. And you would expect the vireo bill, so a longer bill with a hook at the end. Okay, so we know what the species is. Let's try the breeding evidence question. So you observe a barn swallow flying into a barn. What breeding evidence would you report for that species? Okay, get your guesses in. Anybody else? All right, I'm going to end the poll, share the results. Okay, so this one is a little bit tricky, but 50% of you got it right. So this would be a V, species observed visiting probable nest site. And that seems a little bit weird, but we know that barn swallows build nests in human structures, under bridges and in barns. And so a barn swallow visiting a barn is a little bit like a chickadee or a woodpecker checking out a cavity. So we would choose V for this. If we actually went into the barn and saw that there was a nest, then it would become an AE situation. So the adult was observed entering or leaving the nest. Yeah, if for many species, if they were observed hanging around a barn, H would be appropriate. But because we do know that barn swallows will build nests in barns, we go with a V. Okay, and next species. Moving out of my comfort zone here, I did not cover the ducks, Jenna did. So what do we have here? Okay, anyone else? Any last minute guesses? Yeah, ducks are hard. Okay, we got 80% participation. And by far, most of you got it right. This is indeed a common merganser. I threw in the mallard because both common mergansers and mallard males have green heads. But you know that these are mergansers because of their shape, and particularly because of this long straight bill, which is quite different from the sort of wide, flat, typical duck bill. You know it's not a red-breasted merganser because it doesn't have a red breast. And also because on a red-breasted merganser, you see grayish sides on the male, not white sides. Harlequin duck is tricky. They are very pretty birds. These are also very pretty birds, but for Harlequin ducks, you're looking for really distinct white markings all over the face and the body, basically. And they're much smaller, more compact ducks. Okay, so we're now going to move on to the breeding evidence for these guys. So you're out during May, and you notice a pair of common mergansers copulating during spring migration. You know they're a pair because the males and the females look quite different, and you notice them copulating. So what evidence would you enter for these common mergansers? Okay, anyone else? People do seem overwhelmingly sure of this one. 92% of people participating, excellent. Okay, so 91% of people picked courtship display, so D. And you would normally be right, but remember how I said there were some tricks in here tonight? This is one of the tricks. So the thing about waterfowl species is that they will pair up and copulate while they are on migration. And so it's important to remember for the atlas, it's not just about seeing breeding evidence for species, but it's about being able to tie that breeding evidence to a location. And so just because you see the common mergansers copulating on a lake on their migration doesn't actually mean they're breeding in the square you're looking at. So in fact, surprisingly, the correct answer for this one is X. So species observed in its breeding season, but we don't have breeding evidence because we don't know that they are sticking around. It is still during spring migration. They might be going further. And oops, sorry, I forgot to share those results. I apologize. But yes, 91% thought courtship or display, and I totally get it. It was thrown in there as a trick question. Okay, just a couple more to go. So the next one, do we remember what this guy is? So what species do we have here? All right, get your last minute guesses in. I'm gonna go a little bit more quickly through the last couple questions because I do want to get through the last slides as well. Okay, so we have more than 50% getting this right. This is a winter wren. Only wren species that you're going to find breeding here in Newfoundland. And the key that tells you that it's a wren is this upward pointed tail. So that's a very characteristic wren thing. So let's say, just for example, you are out in the winter and you see, or in the winter, I apologize, in the forest, and you see a winter wren carrying twigs and hair into a nest box. So what breeding evidence would you use for this? Okay, we'll close this poll up as well. If people want to get in their guesses. Okay. All right, so I'm going to end it there, share the results. So again, overwhelmingly correct, 89% are right. So this would be an N, nest building or excavation by a wren or woodpecker. If it weren't a wren or woodpecker, it would be NB. But because we know that wrens and woodpeckers build these dummy nests and may not actually be breeding when they're building a nest, we use a different code for them. If the bird weren't carrying anything and we're just visiting the nest site, so visiting the nest box, then it would be a V. Okay, and one final species. Okay, so this is a tricky one. I've lost my polls here. Okay, so first of all, what species do we have here? And remember, this is one that fools even very experienced birders. Seen it happen a lot. It's tricky. Okay, any final guesses? All right, so we'll end that poll, we'll share the results. Just over 50% of you got it right, so 57% got it right, it is a crow. The crow raven thing, super tricky, but when you see them in the sky like this, what you're looking at is the shape of the tail. So on a raven, you would expect a more diamond-shaped tail, whereas on a crow, you have a sort of rounded or straight tail. So a common grackle would have a much longer tail and a glossy head, and a rusty blackbird would be much smaller. Okay, so what do we have going on with this crow? Let's say it's May and you observe an American crow flying by with food in its bill. What breeding evidence are you going to use for this crow? Okay, get your guesses in. We still have a few slides to go through, so. Okay, and I'm going to end the poll there. We've got a little bit of a split here. So lots of people said CF, adult carrying food for young. And again, if it weren't a crow, you would be correct. This was another bit of kind of a tricky one. The thing about crows is that they will actually carry food long distances for themselves. So you may see a crow carrying food, that is absolutely true, but it doesn't mean the same thing for a crow as it would for a passerine bird species. And so actually the correct code to use here would be H. So species observed in breeding season in suitable habitat. So May is the breeding season, crows breed most places. So that would be the code that you would want to use. All right, nice job, everyone. I definitely did pick the tricky ones there, or at least a couple of them. So they're not all that hard. A lot of the time, it's exactly what you think. There are some codes that are invalid, so the system will not accept these questions, but they're not necessarily impossible. So for example, carrying food for most precocial species, so species that don't bring food to their young in the nest. Nest building for species that doesn't build a nest. For example, like the brown cowbird, which is a nest parasite. It's really impossible that you are going to see a brown-headed cowbird building a nest. There are also improbable codes, and this is a case where the computer will give you a warning. So when you go to enter it, you'll get a warning saying, are you sure that's what you mean? But it doesn't mean that it could never happen. So anytime you use that NU, the nest used codes, it will give you a warning just because many nests and eggshells are not unique. And CF for a crow will give you a warning. CF for a common tern will also give you a warning because they can feed their mates during courtship. And so again, it doesn't necessarily mean they're feeding their nestlings. There is actually an Atlas quiz on our website that you can go through that sort of tests you on some of the trickier codes. The other thing that you can do is you can actually use our app. So we have a Nature Counts app for the phone. So there you can go out, collect your data on paper and enter it on your computer when you get home, or you can enter it on in the field on your phone. And when you use the app on your phone, it will actually give you the warning right then and there if the code doesn't work. So that's a really useful way to do it. And finally, I just want to touch on the fact that there are species for which we need a little bit of extra information. And again, that's something that the app on your phone will tell you when you need a bit more information. And these are things that are either provincially or regionally rare, and that includes all of our species at risk. And anytime you see them, we need extra information, specifically where they are most of the time. And then for colonial species, for confirmed breeding records, we need extra information as well. And so what we're really looking for here is just information to either tell us about the colony or to confirm that you've got the right species. So that'll be a description of the bird or colony, the habitat that it's in, often how familiar the bird is with the species and whether the observation conditions were good. So was it good weather, was it good lighting? Obviously, we need to know exactly where you saw it and whether there were any other observers. And if you did happen to have a chance to take a photo or make a recording, then you can attach it to those records as well. Ultimately, as I said, what we're aiming to do is to make maps like this. And so this is a map from the Manitoba Breeding Bird Atlas, obviously, because we're not there yet with our atlas, but it shows all the locations where black and white warblers, in this case, were found breeding in the province. And that's what we're aiming for with the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas. And I just want to finish by touching briefly on why we're doing this. I think you've probably realized by now that it is a lot of work. And so, why are we putting in all this effort? So the answer is we're interested both in bird populations for themselves, but also because birds are really good indicator species. So they are found pretty much everywhere. They're relatively visible and they're relatively easy to monitor, and they're sensitive to environmental disturbances. And so a breeding bird atlas is a really effective, scientifically rigorous way to monitor ecosystem health. And because atlases are designed to be repeated every 20 years, we can actually use it to keep track of what's going on with populations over time. And so there have been 2 maritime breeding bird atlases conducted, one from 1986 to 1990, and then the second one from 2006 to 2010. And because of that, we can compare the probability of observing, in this case, a barn swallow during the first atlas and the second atlas, and we can compare the difference. And so you can see quite easily that during the second atlas, you are significantly less likely to encounter a barn swallow in most of the Maritimes. But it's not always bad news stories either. We can often get good news stories as well. And so these are the same maps for the blue-headed vireo. And you can see that there was actually an increased probability of encountering a blue-headed vireo, particularly in New Brunswick and sort of southern Nova Scotia there. So without breeding bird atlases, these sort of large-scale changes in populations are difficult to detect. As I said, in order to make decisions, for example, to inform land use decisions, development decisions, we really need to know what's out there. So we can't know what we're losing or gaining, and we can't know where to target our conservation efforts for things like, for example, this bank swallow. We can't know that without the baseline data. And then finally, atlases are really, really excellent citizen science tools. So they're a really great way to get people outside and enthused about birds. And I hope that for those of you who've been to a number of our webinars this winter, you're feeling pretty enthused about birds. And this sort of leads me to my final point. You really don't need to be an expert to contribute to the atlas. So this is the breeding map for American robins as of last year, and you will see that there are many, many squares on the island of Newfoundland where we don't currently have any breeding evidence for robins. Does that mean robins aren't breeding there? Unlikely. What it means is nobody's reported it. So even if the only species you recognize is a robin, you can contribute to the atlas by reporting a robin nest when you find one. Similarly, this is a breeding map for the horned lark, which some of you may remember was the bird that we totally forgot to mention during our species descriptions, and Jenna had to mention it during the habitat. These guys really like open habitats, alpine habitats, coastal barrens, and we know that they do breed here, but you can see that they've been detected in very, very, very few squares. And so if you can recognize this bird, you can definitely make a contribution to the atlas. We are 2 years into our atlasing, so we have 2 years of data, and people have been doing a fantastic job. So we are currently at 145 registered volunteers who have contributed more than 4,000 hours of their time to report observations from almost 500 squares. And it's really kind of mind-blowing, especially because the first summer we started was the first summer of COVID. So it turns out that it's quite difficult to launch a major citizen science project in the middle of a pandemic, but it can be done, and the birders of Newfoundland are really rising to the occasion. And all that time put in has led to 161 species being recorded in the province. And so this map just shows you the number of species recorded in several of our squares, or all of our squares. So you can see that people are really doing a fantastic job of this. If you want to join the Atlas team, it's really easy to do. You go to our website, and right up there in the corner, there's a little button that says log in. That will take you to our Nature Counts site. So Nature Counts is the database that Birds Canada uses. And what you will do then is sign up for an account. Here you will find all of the Atlas Square resources. So those maps that I talked about, you can download the PDF map for each of the squares you're interested in. You can also download the point count coordinates if you want to do point counts, or if you want to take out a Zoom recorder. So you'll find all kinds of resources on Nature Counts. And really, the only thing that we ask of atlasers is if you're not sure, don't submit it. So if you don't recognize the species, just leave it out, and that's fine. We also ask that you bird ethically. So remember that we're trying to disturb birds as little as possible. Make sure you get permission to go on private land. Be respectful of each other, of private landowners, of anybody else out on the land, and make sure to be safe and have a lot of fun. And I'm hoping that you will join us, because this is a massive effort to put Newfoundland's birds on the map, and we really can't do it without you. So I'll finish up there. Went a little bit over, but not as much as last week. And I'll take any questions if anybody has any. Otherwise, feel free to check out the Atlas website and email us your questions if you have any.
Thanks, Catherine. I've been busily writing answers to questions in the chat box through the presentation, so I can say some out loud, just if anybody hasn't been reading it as we go along. Somebody asked just now if this is the last webinar. We have one more webinar next week that's going to be about birding by ear and bioacoustics, so that'll be the last one for this series. And someone's asking, is this a different password than the Owl Survey account setup?
So, okay, it's all done through the Nature Count system, and ideally, no, you use exactly the same account. What you want to do if you're registered for one survey and you want to register for the other, you go into your profile and you add a new project to it. If you're having trouble with it, send me an email. It should be intuitive, but it's actually quite difficult to do, so I can definitely help you through it. So just send us an email and we can help you sign up for the 2 surveys.
Perfect. Somebody asked as well if the 12 to 20 hours of atlasing for a square is just for one season. And so I answered in the chat that it's throughout the whole atlasing period. So there's the 5 years to put that time in. So it's really not too much for a square once you spread it out a little bit.
Thank you for specifying. I meant to say that. I had it in my notes that I should emphasize that. Yeah, it's 12 to 20 hours over 5 years. Well, 3 years now, but it's still, it's not as much as it sounds like. It sounds like a terrifyingly overwhelming number, but it's really not. You know, if you go out birding 6 mornings, you've probably covered it.
For sure. Someone's just asking just now, what is the difference between beak and bill? Maybe you can answer that.
That is a good question. Really, they are used interchangeably. Weirdly, I think that people who study birds tend to use bill more. So I'm wondering if beak is more colloquial, but honestly, it's a question I've wondered myself. And as far as I know, they're pretty much interchangeable. Jenna?
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
Someone's just asking now, can observations of nesting in birdhouses within your own backyard be submitted?
Absolutely. 100%.
I'll just read some others that came in before. Someone asked about if we avoid collecting data near cabins where there's lots of feeders or that sort of thing, whether that kind of skews the data. And I answered that we're quite interested in data from anywhere, no matter if birds are being supplemented with food by people or not. But you can add anything if you want to, Catherine.
I mean, it's just, again, thinking about tying it to a location. Birds will come some distance for food, but you know, they're probably not coming from several hundred kilometers away. So chances are if they're at your feeder, they're hanging around within that 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer square. So it's totally reasonable to include that. Also, Jenna, it just occurs to me that I should mention next week is the last webinar, as Jenna said, of this series, but we are hoping in May that we are going to get out and do some led bird walks in locations, hopefully around the island. So stay tuned on that. We don't have any really definite plans as of yet, although I think it is for sure that I'm going to be doing a bird walk on the Burin Peninsula on the weekend of May 14th, 15th. But we'll be posting that schedule on our website and also on the Facebook page. So keep it in mind. We would certainly love to meet some of you in person and go out on a bird walk.
Perfect. I just got a message asking about if atlasing is done just before sunrise, or we can go any time of day. And so I think we can clarify that a little bit, that if you're doing point counts specifically, then you can start doing your point counts half an hour before sunrise and stop doing them 4.5 hours after sunrise, I'm pretty sure. But if you're doing general atlasing or basically going birding, you can do that any time of day or
you absolutely
night.
Can. Yes, yes. And that in a nutshell is why I prefer general atlasing to point counts, because half an hour before sunrise is not my favorite time of day, right, Jenna?
I agree that it is not your favorite time of day.
You're fine, but yeah, no, it's challenging for me.
But point counts are very important.
They are extremely important. And once you're up, it's actually extremely cool to have a listen, and you start to recognize the songs that you hear. So yeah, point counts are, we do want to encourage people to do them. Even if you don't want to get out of bed, it's worth it.
It's worth it. Linda is just asking if it's possible to notify participants of the bird walks ahead of time. And so I think we're planning on putting them up on our Facebook page, probably on the website. Catherine, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think that's what we'll do. So we'll put them on the Facebook page, we'll put them on the website. Because we have different participant lists for each of the webinars, I don't know if we'll be able to send them. I mean, what I'm worried about is somebody who's registered for all of the webinars would get 12 different emails, which I'm sure nobody wants. So it might be a little bit difficult to send them out in terms of a follow-up email. So I would say just keep an eye on the website and keep an eye on the Facebook page. And if you have a particular location where you would like to do a bird walk and you think that that we could get some people out there, suggest it to us, because we are looking for locations to do this in May.
I'll just put the link for the Facebook page in the chat.
Thank you, Jenna.
In case anyone here is still looking for it. Let's see. Do we know if the Newfoundland Atlas is going to be published in a paper copy?
Well, we don't. It's not entirely decided yet. The bulk of the atlas will be online. All of our atlases are these days. However, there has been some discussion about whether we'll have a hard copy of anything. And I think that's still up in the air. And honestly, we probably won't know until we finish the data collection period.
Perfect. There's just a couple other questions from in the chat that I already answered. Someone asked if this is similar to eBird, but I think at this point probably you've described it enough. That came more at the beginning. So it is similar to eBird.
Yes, except that eBird doesn't make any effort to sort of direct the coverage the way that we do. So the way that atlases are a little bit different from eBird is it's a snapshot of a particular period of time, and we try and get much more even coverage and complete coverage. Whereas eBird, you get lots of records for places where birders go, but then there are big holes where birders don't go.
Yeah, for sure. And then someone asked if you can use sound ID apps like Merlin.
You can, but I would say not for the point counts. So you can use them yourself during general atlasing to try and to help yourself learn. But the problem is that, well, first of all, point counts are really kind of too fast paced. So you only have 5 minutes, and you need to be able to sort of not even think about things, really, is what it comes down to. You have to sort of know right away. There's not a lot of thinking time, which is why the recordings can be really useful, because you can go back over them afterwards. The other thing is that Merlin, it picks up whatever's closest and loudest, or sometimes it sort of randomly picks things up. And so it's difficult to know for sure that you've identified the bird that you're interested in. That would sort of be my take. Jenna, would you have anything to add there?
Yeah, that's basically what I answered earlier. And I just add that it is a really good tool for people who are trying to learn bird ID by song. So you can definitely look into the Merlin app. It's for free. But yes, definitely not for point counts, I don't think. And then someone's asking, are GPS coordinates necessary for sightings?
So they're only necessary for the particular species that I like, the species that we need more information for. If you see one of our regionally or provincially rare species, it will ask you for specific coordinates. However, depending on how you're entering the data, you don't actually necessarily need to have the GPS coordinates recorded. So if you can identify it on a map, there's an option to pin it on a map. When you put the data in, it will ask you, where did you see the species? And if you can find the point on a map, you don't need to have brought the coordinates home with you. Or if you are using our phone app, so the Nature Counts app for your phone, you can actually do it on your phone and it knows where you are. The GPS tracks you, so you can actually identify it that way. And that's probably the easiest way to do it.
Yeah, I agree. And I'll also just mention that we have, this is maybe jumping the gun a bit for people who are new or maybe thinking of registering to Atlas, but we do have tutorial webinar about how to enter data as well. So there is information about all of that on our website, and we're always happy to answer questions as well.
This is true. And in fact, there is an entire tutorial specifically on pinning locations for species, which we have stolen from the Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas. We didn't make it ourselves, but it's the same system, so it applies exactly the same for us.
Caitlin in the chat is just asking, can you submit recordings from any date, or was it only June 7th to July 7th?
So for the point counts, specifically, if you're submitting point count data and you're using the Zoom recorder to record that data, it does have to be between the 7th of June and the 7th of July. If you're just using sound to identify birds and it's general atlasing, you don't need to submit the recording to us, and that can happen anytime.
Okie dokie. There's no more questions in the chat, and I've brought up all the ones that came up earlier, so maybe we're slowing down here.
Okay. Well, it looks like we still have about half the people left, so I will thank you again all for coming, and just let you know that we are happy to answer questions anytime. And we really, really hope that some of you will put some of the stuff we've talked about in this webinar series to use and participate in the Atlas. It's really meant to be a project to get people outside and excited about birds. So the more the merrier for the Atlas, for sure.
Absolutely. And we will be sending a recording of this around to everyone as well.
Absolutely, yes. Okay, all right. Well, we will say good night then, and hope to see some of you next week when Jenna is going to teach us all about birding by ear. Thanks very much, everyone.